Salam sejahtera anda bersama saya Naila Huda dalam cerita jam ini. Pagi ini, rakyat Australia tidak dapat membaca ataupun kongsi berita melalui Facebook seperti biasa. Ini selepas Australia mencadangkan undang-undang baharu yang menuntut gergasi teknologi seperti Facebook dan Google untuk membayar untuk kandungan yang dikeluarkan syarikat berita. Kerajaannya hari ini mengutuk tindakan Facebook yang didakwa menyekat akses pengguna kepada maklumat penting, terutamanya dalam tempoh kritikal ini di tengah-tengah pandemik. Dan ketidaksepakatan antara kerajaan dan Facebook ini menimbulkan pelbagai soalan serta meninggalkan impak besar kepada pemeliharaan kandungan berita dan juga kepada landscape digital. Ia turut mencerminkan kuasa dan pengaruh besar yang dipegang syarikat-syarikat teknologi dan di pasaran dan ekonomi dunia. Kerajaan Australia bagaimanapun tetap komited untuk menguatkuasakan peraturan baharu itu bagi menuntut bayaran untuk kandungan berita daripada media tempatan. Dan kita nak bincangkan lebih lanjut impak ketidaksepakatan ini kepada media tempatan dan bersedia untuk mengulas perkara ini wartawan dan penerbit ABC News Max Walden di Melbourne. Terima kasih Max bersama saya di cerita dalam Astro AWANI and izinkan saya teruskan dalam bahasa Inggeris. Max, Australians woke up to empty news feeds on Facebook today. How was the overall reaction from where you are?
Yeah, look, I think the response was obviously shock, in some cases outrage, and many just feeling confused. It wasn't necessarily that Facebook was empty, but of course it was sort of news sites were taken down. But as well as that, there was sort of a bunch of government pages, including those providing important information about COVID. And, you know, there's certain natural disasters happening at the moment. There's floods and fires in various parts of the country. You know, government pages providing information about those things, you know, weren't available. And other things like, you know, domestic violence services or even Facebook's own page on Facebook were blocked or stripped of content. And some sort of satirical news sites, like you've got the Tapia Times in Malaysia, you know, things like that were also caught up in this kind of stripping of news content. So, yeah, I think a lot of people have sort of been quite perplexed by all of this. And certainly, I think it's fair to say amongst a lot of journalists, there is kind of, yeah, sort of a sense of outrage and anger about this.
Max, when exactly did this dispute emerge and how did it come about?
Yeah, so I think, you know, it's about 4 years ago, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission launched an inquiry into big tech and the media. But it's really begun to sort of heat up in the last year or so after the government said that it would sort of act on some of the recommendations of this commission and introduce a news and digital media bargaining code. So under that code, you know, big tech companies like Google and Facebook would be forced to sort of enter negotiations with news organisations and pay them to host this content. And the government sort of says that it will be, you know, this money will be sort of used to fund public interest journalism. And so, of course, these companies have lobbied really hard against the changes. Google previously said that it would completely pull its search function, which obviously is quite significant given, you know, something like 95% of Australians use Google for their main search engine. But in a way, Google has sort of seemingly come to maybe hit a negotiation in that within the last couple of days it signed agreements to kind of pay Seven West Media, which is a big media conglomerate, and then also Rupert Murdoch's News Corp that was announced today had reached an announcement. So it's kind of interesting timing that within days of these deals being struck between kind of media outlets and Google, Facebook has now kind of taken, I guess, what some people call the nuclear option, or, you know, the most drastic option possible by completely removing news content from news feeds.
Max, I understand how to look at this from the perspective of, you know, being in a news organization myself, and being in a particularly very critical time, you know, the dissemination of news during a global pandemic. This is surely very important and critical. So, you know, from the perspective of a reporter and a producer in ABC News, how exactly has this impacted your news organization, and what is your stance on this as an organization?
Yeah, well, look, I can't necessarily speak on behalf of the organisation, but the ABC did release a statement today where they encouraged people to sort of access ABC News content directly through the website, through the ABC's app, and of course it's a broadcast organisation, so there's television, there's radio. I mean, a lot of the traffic in terms of digital news does come directly through the website and the app. So, in some ways, I imagine the ABC is not particularly worried. Although, I think a big concern raised by many in the media is that, in a way, this will really hurt independent publishers, particularly smaller news websites or sort of media startups. That really use social media to gain that traction, and Facebook's obviously a really important source of traffic for kind of independent media. Obviously, the big guys will continue to kind of attract viewers and readers, but I think it's really unfortunate for those independent publishers. So I think probably most people would be concerned, or at least I can speak for myself in sort of feeling a bit concerned about what this might mean for media diversity in Australia, and looking at the emergence of kind of new, interesting digital platforms. They might get drowned out by a move like this.
And how do you foresee this having a ripple effect in perhaps other countries to maybe follow suit, or maybe after seeing Facebook's move today, a bit drastic, they'd be less inclined to? What do you think?
Yeah, well, I think really all of this and the lobbying, on both Google and Facebook's behalf, is really kind of providing, making an example of Australia, right? Like punishing Australia, and that's really to show a global audience. Obviously, Australia is only a small part of Facebook and Google's business, so the stakes really are kind of lower here. But it is sort of showing. To larger markets, in the US and obviously Europe, all across Asia, of course, where Facebook's massive too. But sort of nonetheless, I guess regulators are still looking to rein in big tech, and Australia's government insists that it's not going to back down. So we could well see other governments taking similar measures and a path into the future. I'm not necessarily sure that governments will be completely deterred by this. And especially because I guess Facebook is seen to have kind of done a lot of damage to some democratic societies. And of course, many have noted that Facebook was kind of the platform in which a lot of, incendiary rhetoric against the Rohingya emerged, and eventually, there was an event that, many see as a genocide. And at the time, Facebook was seen to have not done enough, yet when it kind of stands to lose some profit, it takes quite drastic measures in this way. So I think governments will probably look on that fairly harshly. It's also important to note that French publishers, there's a sort of a range of French publishers that have entered agreements with Google similar to those in Australia. And Canada's also said that it's kind of preparing similar laws to that proposed by the Australian government. So I certainly think that things are changing worldwide. And in a way, as I've said, Facebook's move is really not because they care hugely about Australia. It's more to kind of set this example for the rest of the world and to kind of send a warning to other governments.
Max, how would you describe the social media landscape in Australia? Because it's quite clear in Malaysia that you see, the Facebook and the Twitter bubbles are quite different, a bit separate at times, and the way that news gets disseminated, the kind of news that gets consumed as well is very polarizing at times. And so how is it like in Australia, and how important is Facebook as a platform for news dissemination, particularly in the time of COVID as well?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think, there's that kind of generational gap with all sort of social media platforms. Obviously, it's typically, I guess, older people that are on Facebook. I do think it's probably still an important source of news for many people, though. What comes on there their Facebook timeline. I mean, I can speak for myself. Certainly, sometimes I see things for the first time on Facebook, which, and I'm a journalist. So it's not as though, this will impact everybody, but certainly I think, particularly for those kind of older generations. And I think a real concern for a lot of people is that, particularly in this kind of COVID era, and, the importance of, reliable health messaging, the concern is that there's already been a lot of traction on social media, particularly on Facebook, around, anti-vaxxing and sort of conspiracy theories about the coronavirus. And, in a way, Facebook's removed all of the reliable sources of information today in Australia, yet all of these kind of unreliable sources that are sharing deliberate misinformation and completely, made up conspiracies about coronavirus, they're still allowed to remain up. So I think this does kind of remain a huge concern for government and certainly anyone who, cares about truth. Obviously, the media is not beyond reproach and everyone's allowed to kind of criticise and critique the media. But I do think it sort of serves an important role. And if you're completely removing those reliable sources of information and news in real time, particularly during a pandemic, I think there's a good reason why a lot of people feel quite angry and upset about this move by Facebook.
So what can we expect to happen next? Because based on what I've seen today, it seems like the government is playing hardball. They're not going to take this down easy. So what do you think will happen next? Will negotiations still go forward between Facebook as well as Google and the government?
Yeah, I mean, over the course of the day, I think you could see sort of the government tone shift somewhat. But certainly, as you said, they are really playing hardball. The government, the Prime Minister Scott Morrison has sort of said that Australia won't be intimidated by big tech, and this morning the Treasurer Josh Frydenberg said that he had spoken to Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg, and I think he described the conversation as productive. Yet obviously, through the course of the news cycle today, and Parliament sat, there was debate over the news code. And you've got the opposition here as well, kind of criticising the government for not being able to develop a viable news code. I certainly do think that, we haven't seen the end of this debate by any means. That said, I do think that the government will continue to push forward. They do seem very serious about this, and this is, I think since the beginning of the discussion, they never looked to be likely to back down. However, I do think from experts I've kind of talked about this with, I think, the laws themselves have been criticised by a lot of experts, basically because the laws themselves are not necessarily that well constructed and don't necessarily understand, the nature of how the internet works. So I think, you would hope that both sides, can come to a better solution whereby, it's a negotiated solution. Clearly whatever legislation the government's come up with, it's not necessarily going to be perfect on the first time. So you would hope that, there's more productive conversations and that, I suppose news content's not permanently removed from news feeds here in Australia. But I guess you never know.
All right, thanks so much, Max, for joining me and speaking about what's happened in, between Facebook, social media giants and the Australian government that will surely, I think, set a ripple effect and set a precedent for what's to come in terms of news in the digital landscape. Thanks so much, Max. Itu tadi kita dengarkan perkongsian Max Walden, merupakan wartawan ABC News dari Australia, menceritakan tentang impak sekatan maklumat di Facebook ini, sekatan akses berita di Facebook yang baru saja berlaku pagi ini di Australia. Susulan daripada undang-undang yang dicadangkan kerajaan menuntut bayaran daripada syarikat gergasi teknologi, meminta mereka untuk bayar untuk kandungan berita yang dikongsikan pada platform itu, dan ini menimbulkan pelbagai persoalan dan mungkin juga akan mendatangkan kesan kepada undang-undang sosial media di negara lain juga. Mungkin di negara kita akan menyaksikan mungkin peraturan yang lebih ketat terhadap perkongsian berita lagi-lagi di tengah pandemik ini. Itu antara persoalan yang berlegar-legar selepas atas apa yang kita saksikan di Australia. Terima kasih sekali lagi kepada Max, dan selepas ini kita nak bincangkan pula tentang kes membabitkan Datin Sri Rosmah Mansor, dan kita akan bersama dengan wartawan Astro AWANI Ridauddin Daud mendengarkan kisah melaporkan berita tersebut dan bagaimana situasi dan suasana dalam mahkamah ketika membuatkan laporan itu, dan kita akan berhenti seketika, kembali selepas ini.